Test, test. Member Mike, test, test.
Subcommittee on Economic Development and Public Buildings and Emergency Management will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee at today's hearing and ask questions without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. The chair now recognizes himself for the purposes of an opening statement for 5 minutes. I want to thank our witness, the Honorable Deanne, Deanne, is it Deanne or Deanna? Deanne Criswell, the Administrator of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA as we call it, for being here today. Today we are focusing on the current state of FEMA's readiness, response, and recovery. FEMA's core mission is to help people before, during, and after disasters. Unfortunately, FEMA has added layers of bureaucracy and adopted political agendas which have impacted how it delivers on its core mission. The Biden administration is imposing an agenda focused on climate change and equity, which is diverting away from FEMA's core mission. On August 28th, the committee was alerted that the Disaster Relief Fund, we'll consider that the DRF at this point, would move to immediate needs funding, or INF, until additional funds are appropriated. Now, under INF, federal reimbursements to states, territories, and federally recognized tribes for long-term disaster recovery projects are halted. Instead, the remaining balance in the DRF is reserved for any immediate life-saving response activities. Committee staff first asked FEMA back in February, that's a long time ago now, what it was going to do to avoid the DRF running out of money, since FEMA's own monthly reports indicated the DRF was projected to be depleted by now, in September, where we are. FEMA provided no real solutions or answers. Despite ongoing inquiries in the weeks and months since, we were not notified of a supplemental request until it was officially submitted to Congress in August, last month, and the request was tied to Ukraine spending. Now, in the wake of one of the deadliest fires in United States history, a supplemental request for additional disaster funding comes with strings attached to Ukraine. You just think about that in the audience, if you're watching this. The American taxpayer, the people that are suffering from disasters, and somehow couldn't be bothered to discuss getting the DRF refunded until August, and it's tied to Ukraine. I can't reconcile that. I have overarching concerns about decisions being made that waste taxpayer dollars and reduce our readiness. We see FEMA's funding requests to support domestic disaster response activities tied with Ukraine. We see FEMA under the administration significantly expanding its mitigation programs in ways that no longer require projects to demonstrate that they will in fact reduce costs or actually save lives, all in the name of equity and climate change. We also see FEMA resources diverted for other purposes, such as the border crisis, despite FEMA reportedly being understaffed and obviously underfunded. The Homeland Security Act prohibits the diversion of FEMA assets, functions, or mission for the continuing use of any other DHS organization unless such assignments do not reduce the capability of FEMA to perform its missions. Yes, and yet your agencies can't be bothered to follow that law. That is concerning to me. FEMA clearly has a significant capacity problem, and every diversion of resources undermines its ability to perform core missions. The GAO confirmed this capacity issue at a hearing earlier this year. But we know in response to letters from Chairman Graves of the full committee to FEMA that the key FEMA personnel have been diverted by the Secretary to assist with bringing people into the country illegally. FEMA's Emergency Food and Shelter Program, originally created to help homeless Americans, has now become a program to pay for illegal foreign nationals residing in our communities and in our cities. I know I may disagree with many of my colleagues on the role of the federal government and what it should play when it comes to disasters, but regardless, FEMA should not be used to advance partisan policy objectives and FEMA resources, taxpayer resources through FEMA, should not be diverted for other purposes unrelated to its mission. Ultimately, all of this impacts FEMA's readiness and ability to respond to disasters happening across our country, from the Maui wildfires to Hurricane Idalia and multiple flooding events. Now, we can debate the role of the federal government, but at the very least, we need to ensure FEMA is focused on its core mission, because that is the one thing that this Congress, or that a Congress and the President agreed to and signed into law. I look forward to hearing from you today, Administrator Criswell, and I now recognize the ranking member, Member Titus, Representative Titus, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Administrator Criswell, for joining us today as we discuss FEMA's ability to lead disaster response and recovery. Since your testimony to the subcommittee last year, climate change and severe weather incidences have continued to generate dire circumstances that your agencies had to deal with. That disaster relief fund, as a result, which serves as the backbone of your response and recovery programs, is nearing depletion. So it is of utmost importance that Congress fulfill the President's request for supplemental funding, and we should do that free of any poison pills that try to impose social policy into this area. That's the only way that FEMA can continue to provide the necessary resources for ongoing recovery efforts like we are seeing in Maui and Florida, and we're likely to see even more emerge in the near future as we are into hurricane season. So I appreciate your steadfast leadership of FEMA during this difficult time. My home state of Nevada has also experienced some terrifying impacts of climate change, and want to take time to thank the FEMA people and the emergency response managers in my state for their rapid response to the extreme weather that threatened communities, especially in southern Nevada. You don't think about having a hurricane in the desert, but indeed we saw that across Southern California and some of its impact into the southern part of Nevada. We also had unrelenting heat, and we know that heat is a threat just like other natural disasters that needs to be addressed. And we had repeated flash flooding. A wadi or a channel that can be dry for years can suddenly become a rushing river. And we have a drought in the West that's been ongoing and likely will cause some of these disasters to get worse in the coming years. So as we work together with Nevada communities, I think this demonstrates one of the priorities of the administration, which is an all-of-government approach, and that's the only way we can deal with this. In addition to all of government, we think equity is important. We think that solutions must guarantee that all disaster survivors and communities are created and treated fairly by these programs, and these programs are addressed fairly regardless of the neighborhood. Natural disasters amplify existing disparities in our society, and it should go without saying that government is here to address the needs of every American equally, not just the more affluent neighborhoods should be rebuilt as we try to respond to these kind of crises. The subcommittee has received considerable testimony from underserved communities about their frustration of how they seem to be ignored, how much time it takes, how they're not in a position to get additional funding, and we need to be sure that FEMA addresses that. And I know that you do, Administrator. I know you recognize these long-standing disparities, and you've been working with us to try to address them. We appreciate your work to implement new laws and policies that will have these long-term benefits and improve the well-being of victims all across the board. I especially appreciate and value your public support for reforms in a bill introduced by myself, Congressman Garrett Graves, Congressman Troy Carter, and Congresswoman Jennifer Gonzalez-Colon, and this is the Disaster Survivor Fairness Act. We passed that out of the full committee unanimously earlier this year. I'd like to see it come forward because it was unanimous, bipartisan, and it was designed to make federal disaster aid more accessible to survivors. And it can contribute to some of the problems that the chairman has pointed out about making it more efficient and more effective. It removes barriers by creating a universal application for federal assistance, and it empowers the agency to assess home damage more fairly, more quickly, and more accurately. This should ease the burden on families applying for disaster assistance, and we hope to see it pass because these are the worst times in their lives, and that's the least their government can do. So, Administrator, I thank you and your colleagues for the work you've done to shepherd FEMA in a positive direction. I think you've done that by acknowledging and addressing the impacts of climate change, prioritizing equity, which we think is important, and investing in mitigation and resilience so we do build back better. We recognize the challenges you face, and we want to do everything we can to help you, and we know that that fund needs to be replenished. So thank you for being here, and I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady from Nevada. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Graves, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, and thank you, Administrator Criswell, for being here today. On a bipartisan basis, the committee, and this subcommittee in particular, has worked to improve FEMA and the federal government's emergency management system. And I'm proud to again be one of the co-chairs of FEMA's National Preparedness Month, which helps educate the American people on what they can do to be prepared. So FEMA's role is critical, and we've had recent flooding and tornadoes in my district, and it's important for FEMA to work quickly and closely with the state emergency management agencies and local responders. So last month, on August 4th, an EF2 tornado ripped through the city of Bering in Knox County, Missouri, in my district. And Governor Parson submitted a federal disaster declaration on September 6th, and I hope that FEMA will work swiftly and efficiently to approve this declaration so that people in Missouri can continue to recover. I also hope that many of the reforms that we have passed in my time on the committee is going to help remove a lot of unnecessary red tape and bureaucratic policies as we move through the recovery process. So I look forward to hearing what the Administrator, what you have to say today and other critical issues as we prepare for and to respond to disasters all across this country. And with that, Chairman Perry, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, for 5 minutes for his opening statement.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair Perry and Subcommittee Ranking Member Titus, for calling today's hearing. It'll be an opportunity today to discuss the many challenges FEMA is facing due to a busy disaster season and then the strategies to overcome those challenges. Climate change is making disasters more frequent, intense, and costly. NOAA disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion. The 23 separate events with each of those events exceeding $1 billion. Disaster season is far from over, so this figure is bound to grow. The intensity of this year's disaster season is rapidly depleting the agency's disaster relief fund. I am very concerned about the lack of funding available to fight these disasters and the impact on FEMA's authorized programs. In the wake of Maui's wildfires and anticipation of Hurricane Idalia, FEMA announced the implementation of immediate needs funding last month to save what little money FEMA has left. I understand that FEMA is only obligating funds for direct aid to disaster survivors and actions that immediately save life and property. The result is all other recovery projects, such as rebuilding roads, bridges, and schools, are on hold indefinitely. Now, FEMA's had to put about 1,610 recovery and mitigation projects on hold, impacting nearly every state and every community in our country. The current state of the Disaster Relief Fund is not FEMA's fault, however. It is Congress's responsibility to provide enough funding in annual appropriations. So it's imperative that Congress work together in a bipartisan manner to replenish the DRF as soon as possible so that FEMA can continue to fulfill its mission of helping people before, during, and after disasters. However, addressing the record number of billion-dollar disasters requires more than just adding more money to the DRF. FEMA needs to adapt and implement a strategy of readiness for an evolving world so it can provide an adequate response each time a disaster is declared. Deputy Administrator Hooks briefed us earlier this year on current efforts outlined in FEMA's strategic plan to address that. And I appreciate the time that Regional Administrator Nunn in Region 10 and his team took to run a disaster response tabletop exercise with my staff in Washington State. The exercise was very informative and facilitated several important connections. In fact, it's something I would encourage other members to do in their regions with their FEMA regional directors to better understand Congress's role in responding to disasters. But there's always more work to be done. With more than 50% increase in storms and disasters in the last 10 years, FEMA must use science to incorporate climate change projections into all of its programs. In order to address modern natural disasters, we also need to expand mitigation and increase resilience. Overwhelming evidence shows that mitigation is a common sense, cost-effective way to save lives and property. So I support expanding funding and access for mitigation and resilience projects. And we need to leverage all the resilience funding provided by the bipartisan infrastructure law. This landmark legislation included a $7 billion investment for pre-disaster mitigation programs, which made it possible for FEMA to support the largest notice of funding opportunity in the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, the BRIC program, the largest NOFO in its history, last Congress, and funded the new Storm Revolving Loan Fund program. I also have new authorities provided by legislation such as Representative David's Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act will also help the agency target funding to communities with the greatest need and highest risk of natural disasters. We have to ensure all communities have equal opportunity to access these vital funds, and this can be achieved by providing additional technical assistance to underserved applicants and simplifying the benefit cost analysis requirement. More needs to be done to ensure our nation's readiness by incorporating climate change projections into all FEMA's programs and to make access to pre-disaster mitigation grants equitable. Administrator, you have a difficult job. I want to thank you for the work that you do and that your team does and that they've done under your leadership. Your dedication and service to communities throughout the country is well noted, and we need to do our job in supporting FEMA's efforts to ensure more equitable outcomes and building a more resilient nation. So I look forward to discussing how we can work together to drive needed reforms and help FEMA achieve its goals. And thank you for being here. Look forward to your testimony, and yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Washington. I'd like to again welcome our witness and thank you for spending your time with us here today. I know you're busy, and we appreciate your presence. Briefly, I'd like to take a moment to explain our lighting system to you. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means to conclude your remark. It actually means you probably should have already concluded your remarks, but we'll give you a little grace there. I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statement be included in the record without objection so ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the official record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes, ma'am. With that, Administrator Criswell, you are recognized for 5 minutes for your testimony and statement.
Thank you, Chairman Perry, Ranking Member Titus, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss the state of FEMA. FEMA has a powerful mission statement spelled out in just 7 words: helping people before, during, and after disasters. That mission statement, it is our North Star, and it reflects a deep and abiding commitment of our workforce to public service. And I can say without hesitation that our mission at FEMA has become more challenging. We can no longer really speak of a disaster season. From atmospheric rivers in January to tornadoes and wildfires in December, we now face intensified natural disasters throughout the year, often in places not used to experiencing them. In just the last several months alone, we have seen disasters ranging from record flooding in Vermont to the deadliest wildfire in over a century on the island of Maui, to the first tropical cyclone to make landfall in California since 1938. It is therefore vital that FEMA be able to tap into a properly funded disaster relief fund. We strive to be vigilant stewards of the taxpayer dollar, and we are careful in our budget predictions. However, there are times when disasters outpace our appropriated funds, and we are in such a moment today. The administration has requested a supplemental funding package that includes $16 billion for the Disaster Relief Fund. and I urge congressional approval of this request and the administration's fiscal year 2024 budget request as soon as possible. As a result of the dwindling DRF, on August 29th, FEMA implemented immediate needs funding for the first time since 2017. Under INF, we are prioritizing life-saving and life-sustaining disaster response and delaying obligations for longer-term work. As a result, we have needed to pause obligations to over 1,000 public assistance projects across the country worth over $1.5 billion. And you all have my commitment that FEMA will move quickly to resume obligations paused under INF as soon as the DRF is replenished. But again, Congress must act today without delay. Of course, to be effective, FEMA requires not only funding, but a well-trained workforce ready to deploy at a moment's notice. And the vast majority of our 22,000-person workforce are reservists. And I thank this committee and Congress for passing the CREW Act last year, which extended to our reservists USERRA job protections. This law is already improving our recruitment and our retention efforts. FEMA is also working to constantly improve the technology our programs use. After Hurricane Ian impacted Florida, we implemented a unique rapid debris removal task force that used a combination of satellite, flyover, and on-the-ground data to identify areas where the debris was particularly concentrated and cleared 19 million cubic yards of debris, enough to fill more than 5,800 Olympic-sized swimming pools within 6 weeks across the hardest-hit areas. This was months faster than we have been able to do previously. We are also using remote sensing technology in Maui to match homes listed in our individual assistance program with detailed map images. When a match is made, the survivor's case information is shared with our housing inspectors, who can then reach out to survivors without requiring them to be present at their destroyed homes. We will continue to leverage technology such as this to achieve this kind of people-first results. But FEMA is not only a response and recovery agency. We also work to mitigate the worst impacts of disasters before they occur. An essential way to build resilience across our country is through adoption of hazard-resilient building codes, which have avoided at least $32 billion in losses from natural disasters since 2000 alone. And I recently met with survivors in Horseshoe Beach, a small community in Florida's Big Bend, which received the brunt of Hurricane Idalia's wind and storm surge recently, but where many buildings remained largely unscathed. I talked with one homeowner who owned several such properties, and he told me clearly, "I built to code, and codes work." However, 2 out of 3 communities in the U.S. do not yet have up-to-date building codes, and we are implementing a national strategy to help incentivize their adoption. Another way in which FEMA is working to increase the resiliency of our nation is through our new Safeguarding Tomorrow Revolving Loan Fund program, which will give local governments another tool to finance projects to mitigate against natural disasters. And I want to thank you for the significant investment in the BRIC grant program, for which we have announced nearly $4 billion for mitigation projects across the nation. Every day, I see the unwavering dedication of our FEMA workforce to help people before, during, and after disasters. And I ask you to ensure that our workforce has the resources it needs for that mission. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. We will now turn to questions for the administrator. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes for questions. Administrator Criswell, probably is no surprise to you, I don't sometimes agree with my colleagues on what the role of the federal government should be in disasters, but I do believe whatever the federal government's role is, it should be efficient and actually help people. I recently learned of a situation in which a small business contractor has waited months, I actually think it's years now, to be reimbursed for emergency work, and I have heard of some contractors literally waiting years. I used to be a business owner, and your receivables are important. It's It's how you plan on being able to pay your employees, grow your business, pay your taxes, pay your insurance, buy equipment, et cetera. How do we expect private sector partners to step up following disasters if they can't count on your administration? But I would imagine if you think you're working for the federal government, that would be a guaranteed paycheck as long as you do the work to standard and as required. But if you're going to wait months and years to the point now where this one particular company is laying off its staff because they can't be paid by you, how do you expect anybody to be willing to work for FEMA in a moment of crisis where you got to move quickly, you're in a hurry, everybody's in a hurry because people are suffering the effects of the disaster? What's your answer to that? How does that get solved?
Chairman, I obviously don't have the specifics of the company that you're speaking of, but we work through our states and with our local entities to reimburse for the work that is being done as they rebuild after these storms. Part of our process is to make sure that we are collecting all of the appropriate documentation for the work and making sure that it's done in alignment with.
So if it's done and all the paperwork's in this particular instance, and I don't want to mischaracterize anything, you or them, so I'm not going to name that company, but we can talk offline about it. Everybody's doing this, right? They went in and did the work, they relocated their people, they did the work, the disaster's over, everybody's happy and with the work, but yet there are millions and millions of dollars unpaid now for years.
Yeah, Chairman, every situation obviously is specific and unique to that situation. I would be happy to get with you offline and better understand the specifics of what you're talking about, and I'll be happy
But you
to break
understand
through
that
any
other
barriers
contractors
that
that are watching that circumstance are going to be reluctant to respond in a similar circumstance if they know that they're not going to be paid for years in the tune of millions of dollars. You understand that, right?
Again, Chairman, I don't know the specifics of which one you're talking about. We reimburse billions of dollars
I know you do.
every year to communities and states to do the recovery and rebuilding work. It's unfortunate that there is one specific example that you're talking
Right.
about, but I'm happy to work with you on resolving that.
Okay, ma'am, the devastation in Maui draws concerning parallels to the Camp Fire in California and the role of PG&E in that fire. In fact, the Wall Street Journal has reported that Hawaiian Electric is seeking legal advice from PGE and itself and how to deal with the consequences of their actions. The Maui fires, like the Camp Fire in California, appear to be the result of net zero policy, diverting resources away from fire mitigation towards renewable energy. Now, that's not on you, that's their decision. But this does mean the victims of the wildfires are the victims of self-imposed, irresponsible, and now deadly climate policy-created disaster. It wasn't the consequences of CO2, it was the consequences of these policies that destroyed their property, killed their loved ones, and ended over 100 lives. The net zero madness started in 2015 when Hawaii became the first state in the nation to mandate a transition, require a transition to so-called renewable energy by 2045, and they said they would reach the net zero benchmark 5 years ahead of schedule, then retired 2 conventional power plants and sought to replace them with 900 megawatts of renewable power. The same year, after one of the worst wildfire seasons in Maui to date, Hawaiian Electric identified the significant risk of wildfire to their system and the need to implement mitigation efforts. They identified it. But then they prioritized renewable energy over fire mitigation. To date, little or no mitigation work has been completed. Instead, they spent millions on this transition to renewable energy. This is a concerning trend of policy-induced wildfires, and it raises a lot of questions about the opportunity to costs associated with rapidly transitioning under mandate, not under market, under mandate, to unreliable technologies at significant cost to the ratepayer and obviously devastating consequences to homeowners. Make matters worse, I'll just go on a little bit here and I'll truncate my remarks on that. But let me ask you this. This has become the policy of not only Hawaii, but many Western states where wildfires are prevalent. Should the American taxpayer, through FEMA, be responsible for paying for recovery efforts if states are diverting money away from mitigation efforts to misguided net zero policies that actively exacerbate fire conditions and endanger the citizens of those states? Should the taxpayer be required to pay for that?
Chairman, we're seeing an increase in the number of wildfires across the U.S. and our
I don't know
role
that that's
at
true, but
FEMA.
regardless, what I'm talking about is what's causing them. Policies are causing the wildfires. People are losing their lives and their property. Should the rest of America be paying for that when that can all be avoided? That is the question.
FEMA's role should always be to go in and support the response and recovery of communities that are impacted by any type of severe weather event.
Regardless of poor management decisions that are
We
life-threatening.
also have several programs that help communities invest in mitigation to reduce the impact. That is a focus that we need to continue to work on together.
Are you
help
doing
these
anything to
communities.
reduce the impact of these net zero policies?
To reduce the impact of severe weather events.
No, net zero policies, that's what my question. Are you doing anything to mitigate them so these people's lives and homes can be saved? Are you doing anything in that arena?
Our focus, Chairman, is to work with communities to reduce the impact of whatever the risk is that they're
Okay, so the answer would be no. I thank the gentlelady, and I yield to the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for questions.
Thank you. I'm still trying to figure out how using renewable energy causes wildfires, but I guess there's an explanation for it. You know, trees explode. I don't know. Anyway, we know that the balance is down to $2.4 billion in the relief fund. That sounds like a lot, but as we have more disasters, they last longer, they do more damage, they're more expensive. This money is going to be gone very quickly, and I've been very vocal about supporting supplemental funding to the DRF and saying that it should pass the House without any social policy poison pills attached to it. One area that you don't hear as much about, but it certainly is a partner of yours, is the National Weather Service. Now, the National Weather Service, I think, is one of the strongest federal partners we have for emergency managers. We rely on their services daily to predict what's going to happen, forecast, warnings, decision support. Now, the Republicans have proposed slashing the National Weather Service by $200 million this fiscal year. I wonder if you could comment on how that will undermine some of your efforts, or if you think that's a good idea.
Ranking Member Titus, the National Weather Service is such a great partner for us, and all of the sister agencies that go with that, the National Water Center, the National Hurricane Center, all of those components underneath NOAA. They bring us critical data and information as well as modeling to help us anticipate what the threats are going to be to a community so we can put the right measures in place to help protect them, whether that is as we're watching a storm develop and allowing us to pre-position resources into areas so we can perform life-saving actions, to predicting what the future might hold to help better invest our mitigation dollars. Any reduction in the ability for us to get that valued information, data, and modeling would have a significant impact on the safety and security of our communities across the nation.
It would negatively affect your ability to spend the taxpayer dollars in the most efficient way to save property and to, more importantly, save lives. Is that right?
I think it would cause us to have an increase in the amount of money that we're spending on responding and recovering because we won't have the accurate data to better mitigate against the future risks that they're facing.
Thank you. I would ask you also your opinion and to tell us a little bit about what you think will be the results if we can get the Disaster Survivor Fairness Act that I mentioned in my opening statements passed. This seems to be supported by both parties, seems to make us more efficient, seems to be a way to speed things up, to be more equitable, passed out of this committee unanimously. Would you talk a little bit about how you anticipate that might be a good idea?
I am very excited and very appreciative of the support of this bipartisan legislation. I believe that the Disaster Survivor Fairness Act is going to make a tremendous difference in our ability to help communities. And there are a wide number of things that are covered in that, but there's three that I really want to point out for the committee. First, it's going to give us the authority to do direct repair to homes. This is going to be quicker, more efficient, as well as more cost-effective than the traditional programs that we use of manufactured housing or temporary housing units. Second, it's going to give us the ability to also provide direct housing grants to states. We've worked with some of our states through our non-congregate sheltering program over the last year to see how much quicker they can implement some of these programs. By giving them the ability for us to give them direct grants, we believe that will also increase the efficiency and the ability for states to better take care of their residents. And then finally, and I think really important, is it is going to give us the ability to streamline information sharing across our federal agencies. Many of our federal partners use our data to help influence how they're going to implement their disaster programs. If we can streamline that level of information sharing, it will make those programs quicker to get online.
Thank you. Well, we need your help advocating for this because I agree with you. I think it would make a big difference and be helpful, and we'd like to see it pass. Something else quickly I'd ask you about are the firefighter grants that are set to sunset next year, next September, merit-based matching grants for local fire departments. Can you address those? Is that, your advocacy for renewing those programs?
Yeah, the reauthorization of our Assistance to Fire Grant program is of critical importance because our firefighters are the backbone of our first responders that are out there. And this grant program, allows us to continue to build capacity in our fire departments, both volunteer and paid departments across the nation. And the ability to have this program in place, if we didn't have it, it would definitely jeopardize our first responders across the nation.
And that's
You
not
have my
just to
support
fight
for this.
wildfires. They do have many other functions as well.
I'm sorry, ma'am?
It's not just to fight wildfires in the West. They
No.
have many other functions as well.
No, this is for
across the
all of our
country.
firefighters, structural firefighters, municipal, as well as, again, our volunteer agencies. Critical program to keep that capability efficient to support the needs that we're facing.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes Representative D'Esposito. I'm sorry, we thought that Chairman Graves would be here, but he's not, so we're going to go to Representative D'Esposito. 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Administrator Criswell. I appreciate you appearing in front of the committee that I chair in Homeland Security, Emergency Management, and Technology. And at that time, we discussed the ever-changing mission. Although FEMA has a mission, that mission has changed over the years. And obviously, most recently in the disastrous southern border that we're dealing with, FEMA recently announced in June that New York City was set to receive $100 million from the Shelter and Services Program to address the ever-growing migrant crisis. Since then, as I'm sure you're well aware, the problem has only worsened. And recently, Mayor Adams, just last month, and I quote, said, "This issue will destroy New York City." Claimed that agencies may have to slash up to 15% from their budgets. Now, prior to you being the administrator of FEMA, you served New York City proudly for 2 years, and I appreciate you leading the Department of Emergency Management. But 15% from the budgets of departments like sanitation, the FDNY, the NYPD, emergency management, buildings, and on and on and on. Has anyone from New York City been in contact with FEMA requesting additional funds to address the migrant crisis after already receiving $100 million?
Representative, we have been in continuous communication with the City of New York. My regional administrator maintains close contact on a regular basis as to understanding what their needs are. And the department recently sent a team down there to do a deep dive with the mayor and his staff on what the current situation is and the needs that they have to have a better understanding. The funding that we have through the Shelter and Services Program is a finite amount of funding. And so we do recognize that they came in with a much larger request than what we were able to appropriate to them.
And how much have they additionally asked for?
I don't have that number right in front of me, but it was well above what we had the ability to give, given the amount of money we had available.
Well, I think part of the problem is, and as someone, and I appreciate all of your time that you spent in emergency management, as someone who has also spent his adult life in the emergency management world, we always ask ourselves, are we better off today than we were the last time we dealt with this issue? And I think it's clear that Mayor Adams had no plan for being a sanctuary city, and when asked by FEMA, what are your needs and what do you need from us, he doesn't have an answer because there is no plan. So Obviously, it's concerning that New York City continues to face the significant challenges that it does. You never want to hear the mayor of one of the biggest cities in the world saying that we have an issue that we're facing that we can't control that is going to destroy our city. How is FEMA evaluating the difference between New York City and other cities and the intended purposes of this new program?
Yeah, the Shelter and Service Program, again, was directed by Congress, and the first part of that funding went out through our legacy program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program for Humanitarian. As we moved into the Shelter and Services Program and the delivery of this as a new grant program, we evaluated the data as it relates to releases as well as destinations to make our determination. In the first part of the program, we had a heavier weight on releases, and in the second part, in the first delivery of the SSP program, we did have a higher focus on the destination cities. As we move into the next fiscal year, if this program continues to be funded, we are going to look at making this a more competitive grant program using current data, since the first delivery was based on existing data, but we know that the dynamics of the situation are real and that the data changes on a daily basis, and we want to make sure we have a better understanding of impacts to communities as we go into the next fiscal year.
So in making these decisions, you and your team have obviously gone through more data than anybody probably ever wants to look at. Do you believe that there is an immigration crisis facing us under the, I would say, failed leadership of the President and Secretary Mayorkas? Are we dealing with an immigration issue throughout this country, specifically in New York City, which borders my congressional district?
Representative, I'm not an immigration agency, but what I can tell you is that my agency will continue to focus on supporting jurisdictions that are managing the care of immigrants through our Shelter and Services program.
And I appreciate that. I only have a few seconds, so I will ask it this way. Are there resources that should be utilized in other areas of FEMA, focusing on its original mission, that are now being taken away because of the issues that we're facing because of the failed policies of Secretary Mayorkas and President Biden?
The only resources that we are contributing to this mission right now are through the delivery of our Shelter and Services program and providing reimbursements to jurisdictions for some of the costs that they're incurring.
Correct. And if we didn't have this issue in place, we would be utilizing that funding for other things in FEMA. Mr. Chair, my time has expired. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the gentleman and ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Administrator, could you just clarify that last answer? Would you be, is the Shelter and Services Program diverting dollars from otherwise, or is this allocated, appropriated dollars into that program that you don't, it's in there, you don't control?
The Shelter and Services Program was an additional allocation to our budget specifically for that program and not diverted from other programs.
So you didn't divert money from other programs?
We did not.
FEMA. Thanks. Speaking of which, other programs, back to the Disaster Relief Fund. I understand you're implementing cost-saving measures until Congress passes supplemental disaster funding. There are quite a number of projects. You noted the number, I noted the number that are being delayed in terms of funding. One of which is in Whatcom County in my district, and we can all talk about our district. But for Washington State, that one program, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, funding delay is a little over 10% of the total amount in Washington State. So can you elaborate a little bit on the urgent need for supplemental funding, but how delaying projects that are funded in different programs can't be funded because of the delay in the problem with the Disaster Relief Fund?
With the current health of the Disaster Relief Fund, again, we've been watching this very closely throughout the year and made the determination to implement immediate needs funding because our focus and our priority needs to make sure that we always have the resources available to support life safety, life-sustaining activities.
Right.
And through immediate needs funding, that's what we're able to do. What we do is delay the obligations for some of this other work. It doesn't mean that the work necessarily stops. It just means that we cannot reimburse jurisdictions for the costs that they incur as a result of that until the DRF is replenished.
Is that because money's reimbursed out of the DRF?
It is reimbursed out of the DRF.
So if it's funded through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, which is for Whatcom County, that's what I believe where those dollars are coming from. Those dollars are spent down, or does the DRF fund the hazard mitigation grant program?
Our hazard mitigation grant program, as well as our Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities program, are both funded out of the Disaster Relief Fund.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that we will see is smaller jurisdictions that aren't getting reimbursed for their projects, they're not going to be able to continue some of the work because of cash flow issues. And so they'll need the reimbursement for these types of projects so they can continue the work. Even though we don't stop the work, it's really upon them to figure out how they can continue to manage the work being done until they can get reimbursed with the Disaster Relief Fund once it's repaired.
Yeah, and just other jurisdictions have this challenge, and Whatcom County does not have $8.6 million sitting around to continue that work to wait. Even, noting one, it's not my district, but Thurston County's Fire District 3 is waiting on $859. Now, they might be able to find it, but my guess is it's probably a rural fire district as well. So there's quite a range of communities that are being challenged here. On BRIC, you both recently announced, and thank you for getting these BIL dollars out the door. We authorized the STORM program and funded it. And you, 2 weeks ago, announced the first $50 million for STORM. Is that right? Did I got the number right?
Yep, correct. We issued the first $50 million under the Storm Revolving Loan Fund, a new program and a new type of program for FEMA to jurisdictions. And again, this was oversubscribed, but we're really excited about the ability that this program is going to do to help jurisdictions with their cost share portion of some of these very difficult hazard mitigation projects so they can continue to build resiliency in their communities.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit, just briefly, about that? Because I think it's important to understand all this discussion, the challenges you have on climate change, challenges you have with DRF, the challenges you have ensuring we're doing mitigation and resilience, three big themes that I heard from you today. How STORM and the new money that we put in BRIC is helping you achieve maybe at least the mitigation and resilience and helping you turn the corner on what FEMA is all about.
Yeah, Ranking Member Larson, we are absolutely seeing an increase in the intensity, the severity, the length of recovery, the complexity of the types of severe weather events that we're responding to. And we will continue to respond to these events, but we have got to build resilience in these communities to reduce the impact from these events. And the way we do that is through our mitigation programs, whether that's our HMGP program, which is funded after a disaster, where states and jurisdictions have funding after a disaster strikes, or our BRIC program, which can provide funding for pre-disaster, helping them identify what types of projects are going to help make them more resilient. But we know that these projects can be very expensive, and they all come with a cost share. And many of our jurisdictions do not have the funding necessarily to come up with that cost share. And where the STORM program really makes a difference is it can help a jurisdiction through this revolving loan fund to be able to complete these projects and come up with their match or do other projects that maybe aren't going to be funded under one of the federal programs. It's a critical tool to help communities achieve the level of resilience that they're going to need to have as we face a future of climate-related events that is increasing the impacts that we're seeing to communities across the nation.
Thank you. And just quickly, Ms. Chair, if you'll just indulge me, in 2022, Washington State had 662 fires, according to our state DNR. This year, to this date, Washington State has 1,855 fires that our State Department of Natural Resources have responded to. So at least for one state, wildfires are increasing. I just wanted to make sure that got established, at least for my state. With that, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Ezell, Representative Ezell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Criswell, thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate it. Before I was sworn into office, I promised my voters I would focus on flood insurance and flood mapping issues that directly affect my district in South Mississippi. To combat the effects of active flooding, several of these counties are actively engaging in resiliency projects. Accordingly, FEMA is planning to spend $3 billion this year on resiliency projects, in addition to several other agencies across the federal government. Specifically, Jackson County, which is my home county on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, is relying on many of these programs to plan and build projects that improve drainage, enhance our shorelines, and protect our citizens from storms and flooding. Ideally, these investments will provide better protection for properties and help lower flood insurance rates. However, because FEMA refuses to disclose the full algorithms used in Risk Rating 2.0, the county leaders are unable to plan and target projects where they will have the greatest benefits to my constituents, including lowering their insurance cost. My question to you this morning, are resiliency investments taken into account in the Risk Rating of 2.0 algorithm?
Representative, the most important piece about Risk Rating 2.0 is that it now bases flood insurance premiums on each home's unique flood risk, which means that it does take into account mitigation measures that have been put in place either by the homeowner or the community. And that is then directly reflected in the rate that the homeowner sees.
So it does, correct. Yes. All right, thank you. I will be submitting QFRs to provide more certainty on this, and due to time, I'm gonna move on. Congress similarly has explored policies to improve the National Flood Insurance Program, which is unaffordable and unattainable in several areas in my district. I would like to submit the attached letter for the record I wrote to you in July on the topic. Mr. Chairman, in accordance with committee rules, I ask unanimous consent to submit the letter for the record.
Without objection.
The letter references the community-based catastrophe insurance, an innovative approach that allows for customized coverage and empowers local decision-making rather than a one-size-fits-all approach, further reducing the burden on FEMA by promoting self-resiliency. I believe this approach could bring financial resiliency to lower and moderate income households, often facing extreme flooding events, and even save the taxpayer some money. Can I have your commitment to exploring this approach to help better understand our state, county needs, county leads, and individuals, the risk they face in extreme flooding cases? And does FEMA have the authority to use BRIC funding to support similar approaches? Simple answers be sufficient.
Representative, you absolutely have my commitment to continue to work with you on helping homeowners, one, better understand their flood risk, as well as ways that we can help reduce their costs. We know that many of this is unaffordable, which is why FEMA has put forth to Congress an affordability framework to help everybody have the ability to obtain the necessary protection that they need to help protect their families. And so you have my commitment to continue to work with you on that.
Thank you very much. Promoting resiliency is only half the equation. With the rising cost of disasters, even the most resilient communities may still lack the financial resources to adequately respond to a disaster, leaving leaders to take out large sums of credit to cover the immediate cost of recovery. While FEMA does provide assistance in reimbursing these advances, eventually, most must be done to kind of expedite, ease the financial burdens on these disasters. And can I get your commitment to looking at proposals such as FEMA Loan Interest Payment Relief Act as potential solutions to mitigate additional burdens placed on my community?
Yes, we have a number of programs that help communities with their cash flow issues because we understand that that can be a challenge. And so you have my commitment to continue to find ways that we can improve upon that so we can help these communities rebuild in a way that's going to make them more resilient.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes Representative Holmes Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Criswell, it looks like we've got a big double problem. We've got a worsening climate crisis, and we've got insufficient funds in the disaster relief fund. In my district, the District of Columbia, 13 public assistance projects totaling $7 million have been put on pause, as well as $190,000 hazard mitigation project also on pause. It's critical that we replenish the disaster relief fund as soon as possible. Could you speak to the impact on communities and disaster survivors if Congress does not pass supplemental funding for the Disaster Relief Fund?
Representative Norton, right now, we are closely watching, the draw on the Disaster Relief Fund and want to ensure that we always have enough funding to support those life safety, sustaining activities that need to happen, which means many of the projects like you described, our obligation and our ability to reimburse those jurisdictions is on hold. The largest impact on that is their ability to continue with new projects until they can get reimbursed for the work that they've already done, and that will delay these communities and their ability to continue to recover. Absent a supplemental, this just means that we are going to be that much farther behind with what is appropriated or what is recommended in the president's budget for fiscal year '24, and will further delay our ability to continue these long-term recovery projects in the months ahead.
In your testimony, you emphasized the need for up-to-date disaster-resistant building codes. This issue concerns the residents of my district, the District of Columbia, which hosts a large number of of historic buildings. In what ways can FEMA aid in pre-disaster mitigation and resiliency of historic buildings?
One of the programs that I am very excited and proud of is our direct technical assistance program that we're doing under our BRIC mitigation program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities, where we are going into communities and helping them envision what types of mitigation projects that they can do and helping them think through what maybe they hadn't thought of before. And we've had great success in supporting a number of communities across the nation to help them design and develop mitigation projects that are going to help protect their communities, especially communities that have such historic nature. And we would be happy to work with you in better understanding some of the communities that you feel might need this type of technical assistance. I mean, we can work with you to try to offer that.
I would appreciate that because that's a special problem here in the nation's capital. Finally, we in the District of Columbia have seen extreme heat. Earlier this month, temperatures soared to at least 97 degrees for 5 straight days, breaking all historic records. How does FEMA help state and local governments respond to extreme heat?
One of the best things that FEMA does to help communities battle the impacts of extreme heat is through preparedness as well as mitigation. On preparedness, what we have done this year is we launched our Summer Ready campaign to help individuals and communities understand the things that they can do to help protect their families that are experiencing extreme heat. But we also know that we have to help communities build resilient infrastructure to help support that, whether that is making sure that they have generators for cooling centers or white roofs to help reduce the heat inside buildings or adding green areas. Our mitigation programs can also be used to help mitigate the impacts of extreme heat for the future events that we're going to see.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes Jennifer Gonzalez Colon from Puerto Rico.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing us together for this hearing. And thanks to the administrator for actually being here to answer many questions. In my case, tomorrow is going to be the 6th anniversary of Hurricane Irma Maria in Puerto Rico. And we're still in the process of approving and performing recovery work for municipalities, non-for-profits, faith institutions, individuals, and many others. The recovery of the electric power grid of the island is still mostly in the planning stages, which is one of the issues that I'm most concerned with. And there's been a historic funding, but there's a very real fear that between delays and cost increase, there will be a missed opportunity and work that was promised and will not get done. To that end, I know that the FEMA recovery page indicates that between all the various disasters in the past few years in the island, FEMA public assistance has allocated and obligated $45 billion for Puerto Rico, almost all out of the disaster relief funds, of which $19 billion has been outlaid. That is transferred from FEMA accounts to the accounts of the entities that are going to be responsible for the work. And on the other hand, FEMA announced $31 billion for public assistance projects, and Core 3, the obligation is near $1.9 billion. But because of most of municipalities or counties on the island, non-for-profits do not have cash on hand or credit to start work before reimbursement, the local institution, Core 3, established a working capital advance system providing $1.2 billion for 38 agencies and municipalities and non-for-profits. However, yesterday in the local press in Puerto Rico, reports that Core 3 announced that as many as 2/3 of those entities will have to return those advances due to not being able to have evidence of the use after a year, and that FEMA is aware and will get a report on this specific week. So to that end, I'm representing the island, so I would love to have a copy of that report that you promised, or at least it's been said that FEMA promised to have a report on that relation of the funds between FEMA and Core 3. As well, the subcommittee of oversight should have that report. My question, Administrator, does your agency have your own record on how much has been actually dispersed to Puerto Rico?
Representative Gonzalez-Colon, we are extremely committed into helping Puerto Rico recover. And since I have taken this position, I have met many times with Governor Pierluisi, and my team is still embedded in Puerto Rico.
Do you have the amount that is being dispersed?
And we absolutely have the amount. And since I have taken this position, we have funded over 10,600 projects that total $30 billion. This is 2,800 projects that have begun construction across Puerto Rico and 1,800 that have been completed. Prior to me coming into this position, there were only 81 projects that had been completed.
I've been here
So we've
all
had
these
a
years.
tremendous increase in the progress that we're seeing across Puerto Rico.
What I would love, because there's a lot of data in numbers and projects and entities that are receiving the funds. If you can provide a committee information about where we are with the latest update of those funds for not just the municipalities, Core 3, and the electrical grid on the island, which is one of the major issues. And how many projects are right now still pending for approval or disbursement from FEMA? Because we got the same issue with the local agencies, which is a complete different process. Another issue that for me is important is with the difference with the section 428 and 406, the cost of inflation for many of those projects has come up. And projects that were announced or with funding in 2018 now may be bigger. As an example, the hospital in Vieques, it was originally $59 million and now it's $85 million. So we got many projects like that that may not have the full amount of, and that will happen with electrical grid on the island. I know my time is going to expire, but I would like the committee to have the precise data regarding the planning stages of the electrical grid on the island, how much is being dispersed, when do you expect that we actually have some construction or delivery of the upgrades of the local plants on the island, which is one of the biggest issues and the biggest reasons the Congress did approve more than $11 billion that are not being used. And that is not your fault. But people of Puerto Rico have been waiting for 6 years. And now the local agencies are telling you not to use power for a week because we don't have enough power to cover the whole island when the funds are being assigned. So having said that, I will provide a committee as well with a list of questions regarding this. And I will hope that the FEMA administrator can provide that to the committee and as well to our office. With that, thank you,
We'll be happy to
Administrator.
provide you answers for the record.
I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
I thank the chair. Administrator Criswell, I want to spend my time asking you about something that is really at the core of FEMA's work, and that is the question of who gets FEMA disaster relief and who doesn't. And let me first say that I am a big believer in the mission of your agency. I think it's one of the great things that our federal government does to make sure that that FEMA disaster relief is there for devastated communities, no matter where they are, no matter what their politics are. And I want to commend you and your colleagues for the dedication that you bring to this critical work. I represent the North Bay and the North Coast of California, so I've seen firsthand what a difference that disaster relief can make for devastated communities. But I have also seen what happens when there is a devastating natural disaster that doesn't quite trigger FEMA disaster relief, and I've seen how inequitable that can be. My district includes a lot of rural, less affluent communities as well. And we have an equity problem when it comes to this mechanism. We leave a lot of rural, less affluent communities behind, and with the climate crisis bringing us more and bigger disasters, we really need to tackle this equity problem now to get ahead of it. So I told you a little about my district. We've got earthquakes, we've got tsunamis, we've got wildfires. It is sort of the poster child for this problem because FEMA's arbitrary and inflexible financial damage threshold can leave devastated communities behind. Give you an example. In 2017, the Helena fire burned 72 homes in Junction City, Trinity County, one of the smallest, poorest rural counties in California. That took out 15% of the county's housing stock. 15% of a county that has modest homes, so the property values were not high enough to reach the threshold. And of course, the county government lacks resources. This is a struggling community. And so they didn't get that FEMA disaster relief. In December 2022, a 6.4 magnitude earthquake struck the small town of Rio Del in Humboldt County. Took out about 25% of the city's housing stock, estimated $26 million in overall damage, a total of $35 million in damage to the county. But again, this is a rural, struggling county, didn't meet the threshold. You know, if you took the same disaster and it happened in an affluent place, Pebble Beach, any number of other places, maybe took out a small fraction of the homes, you'd have no problem triggering federal disaster relief. But these communities were left without that support. The flip side of that, in 2011, there was a massive earthquake in Japan that triggered a tsunami that just wrecked the Crescent City Harbor in Del Norte County in my district. The damage was about $50 million, again, just short of the threshold to get disaster relief. But we got lucky because that same tsunami also hit a harbor in Santa Cruz, further south in the state, where some very fancy yachts were parked. And because those yachts enabled the damage tally to go a little higher, Crescent City did qualify for federal disaster relief. But imagine if some of those fancy boats had not been parked in the harbor at that time, we would have been left with nothing. So, Administrator Criswell, it seems to me that this is fundamentally unfair. And again, with more disasters coming, we really need to provide more flexible, equitable ways for devastated communities to qualify for federal disaster relief from FEMA. And my staff will be presenting you with a letter today. I'm asking you to work with us on this important issue. I believe you have existing authority that would let you do a rulemaking to provide that flexibility and equity. But if you need new authority, additional authority, I hope you will please let us know, and we will get to work to make it happen. Let me just leave it there and ask for your response, and I'm really hoping to hear a commitment to work with me on this critical issue.
Representative, you make some very good points, and it really does show why one of my priorities has been equitably delivering our programs. When it comes to declaring a disaster, we have a number of factors that we take into consideration, whether the state has the capacity to support it, not just the local jurisdictions, but also the amount of insurance and the amount of damage. And it can be very complex. And that is why we are continuing to work on ways that we can improve the way we're delivering our programs, but also better understand the barriers that communities, just as you mentioned, are experiencing to being able to get the assistance that they need in order to properly recover from these disasters. And so you have my commitment to continue to find ways that we can improve the way we're delivering our programs and ensuring that everybody who is eligible for our programs has access to that assistance.
All right, thank you. Yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The chair now recognizes the vice chair of the subcommittee, gentlelady from Oregon, Representative Chavez-Turine.
Thank you, Chairman. It's nice to meet you. I know we have not officially met, but as a new member of Congress, I'm grateful that you're here today to answer the questions that we have. So Administrator Criswell, given your background at FEMA and in Colorado as a firefighter and a fire chief, I'm sure you have a unique and deep appreciation for the devastation caused by wildfires. One of my highest priorities is to find solutions to help Oregonians address the challenges of wildfires. On the House Committee on Agriculture, one of my top Farm Bill priorities is to properly equip our firefighters to get these wildfires under control and prevent them from getting out of hand in the first place. So far, I am championing 9 legislative items in the Congress to tackle these important issues, and this is an issue that I will continue to focus on. In 2020, the state of Oregon experienced its most devastating wildfire season on record, the Labor Day fires, which actually began in August and lasted until November. According to the Oregon Department of Emergency Management, the wildfires burned over 1 million acres, about the area of Rhode Island, affected 20 counties, destroyed or damaged over 5,000 structures, and resulted in over $600 million in damage across the state. The city of Detroit in Marion County was especially devastated by the fires, and my office continues to work with the city to help that community and region recover. In fact, this location was a required stop for my new staff. I had DC go to Oregon to understand what was most important to me and to visit as we set up our new offices. One specific area of frustration brought to my attention concerns Detroit's application to obtain unobligated funds for a water treatment plant. This process continued and has continued for 3 years after the fires. Detroit dutifully completed their paperwork and met FEMA's engineering requirements. However, high turnover at FEMA has forced the city to re-explain the application and re-justify each aspect of the project multiple times. The application's for $5.7 million. Completing the federal paperwork and meeting standards is hard enough, but how is it fair to require a small community to essentially recomplete it over and over again for 3 years? So my question to you is, can you offer any assurances today that FEMA will give the pending application full and fair consideration?
Absolutely, Representative. I will follow up on this personally and ensure that this application is reviewed and that we are giving it full and fair consideration based on the application that is submitted.
I'm happy to follow up. I'm happy to meet with you offline. You know, one of the things I like to do is open my office to get the work done. We have to move the ball down the field, and oftentimes after testimonies like this, it doesn't happen. So I'm committed to get this application moved forward. Regarding the high turnover, what steps can FEMA take to help ensure the agency is able to retain basic institutional knowledge when someone leaves? And then, how can we reduce the burden on the applicant to bring someone new up to speed on an application such as this?
You know, the retention and the recruitment of our workforce is so critical. The majority of the personnel that we have, again, are our reservists, and they are the backbone of what we do, which is why we are very grateful to Congress for the passing of the CREW Act, which gives them USERRA protections, and we have now a broader pool of people that I feel that we can recruit from. And I have talked to reservists firsthand out in the field about how they are already benefiting from this piece of legislation, which is increasing the number of reservists that we can potentially count on. We're also offering new incentives. We're offering recruitment bonuses as well as administrative time off for our reservists after they demobilize. These little steps, I think, are also increasing the desire of our workforce to be able to bring in new people, but also helping them understand that we are there for them and that we recognize the value that they bring, and that makes them excited about their continued work in supporting survivors before, during, and after disasters.
Mr. Chairman, I see my time's going to expire, so I'll yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Representative Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You got a tough job, Ms. Griswold. You really, really do. All around this nation, there's some sort of a disaster going on almost all the time. Thank you. Thank you for your efforts. Thank you for the work that you and your team do. Obviously, all of us believe it to be extremely important, the recovery piece of it. Now, there's always a problem. And some of these problems are in the scope of the issues you face would seem to be mundane. We had a COVID crisis a couple of years ago. There were shutdowns. There were individual counties housed homeless people in separation so that they might not get sick or infect the community. One of those counties happened to represent is awaiting reimbursement for their program. Region 9 made a decision that they wouldn't be paid. That decision appears to be contrary to your national guidance. We'd like you to look into it. We'll get you the specific information, and if you'd take a look at it. Has to do, not a great amount of money in the scope of what you're facing, but nonetheless important to Contra Costa County. So if you'll take a look at that, try to align your guidance with the Region 9 determination to not reimburse. Now, having said that, we'll just let that hang out there. We'll get you the specific information, and if you'll follow it up, we would appreciate it. But in the scope of the issues you have, good luck. We will never be able to deal with disasters unless we continue to press for mitigation. And the mitigation is one of your tasks. And there are a couple of mitigation programs that are of concern here. Specifically, the mitigation having to do with the water infrastructure. One of your programs does not seem to provide for firefighting water infrastructure. It may be a hydrant, it may be a tank. Could you please take a look at that? And if we're going to mitigate, for example, the Camp Fire or Lahontan, how do we do it without water and the water infrastructure? You have a program that can deal with that, and we need to make sure that that would be included. Again, we'll get you specific concerns that we have in California about that. The final point is your revolving loan fund program. It does, if it works, provide the state with money that they can then pass on to counties, cities, others, to get ahead of the problem by using that money to develop mitigation programs. However, you've awarded that to 7 states, about $50 million to 7 states and the District of Columbia. You got about $100 million available. So how about the other $50 million? Maybe you have as much as $200 million. It's not exactly clear how much money is in this revolving loan fund program. Can you push the money out, or is that money now being allocated for the disaster recovery? Please take a look at that. Obviously, California, other states who have spoken here today, the representatives have. What is the status? Can you push the rest of that money out, or is that going to depend upon the additional money that we must provide to FEMA? I don't know that you're up on this issue now. If you are, love to hear your comments. If you're not, I'm sure you'll get back to us.
Representative, the Storm Revolving Loan Fund is such an incredible tool to help our communities build resilience in areas where perhaps they don't have the funding to front some of the costs or even to cover the cost shares for some projects. And so we're very excited about this program. When we first got the authorization and the funding for this program, we wanted to make sure that we could get a portion of that funding out as quickly as possible. And so that's why we did a partial notice of funding opportunity for the initial $50 million that you mentioned. This program also requires, it's a first of its kind program, and it also requires that our state and our local partners build capacity to be able to administer such a program. And so while we did an initial notice of funding opportunity. We have also been working with our state and local partners to help them establish programs so they can administer this. And as we continue to go forward with this program, we will be issuing our notice of funding opportunities for the full amount of this program going forward, while we continue to work with building their capacity.
I'm out of time, but my final comment is I very, very much appreciate the task that you're doing and the extraordinary importance of it. So know that at least some of us want to really support you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I will recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and for the committee members for allowing me to sit in today. Appreciate it. A very important topic. And Ms. Criswell, thank you for your efforts with FEMA and difficult times. Pivoting off what Mr. Huffman said a while ago with tsunami and earthquake and wildfire and flood, and I think we can add pretty much all that in the area I represent adjacently, and who knows, maybe even volcanic eruptions on it someday with the possibilities. But I wanted to, in terms mostly of wildfire, my area has been devastated several times. Mr. Garamendi mentioned the Camp Fire right in my backyard, Paradise, California, only to be eclipsed by Lahaina and loss of life. Incredible. And the Dixie Fire in 21, 1 million acres, lost the town of Greenville and Canyon Dam. So the Lord's blessed us with much rainfall and snowpack this year, so we're not feeling so much of the size and scope of a wildfire that we've been kind of used to lately. But I wanted to speak with you about some of the practical matters. Again, it's hard to get things out the door quickly enough, and we understand that. And some really great work got done by FEMA, working with Cal OES and the local governments on those other fires, kind of having to build from the ground up on wildfire, since it hadn't been quite the big area that FEMA had to do in the past. So, but we're still having trouble on timing of things like that, and getting, whether it's been the housing, the trailers and things. I want to touch on what's called the North Complex Fire, centered in Butte County, California, a town, Berry Creek, and you might well be familiar with this. The Lake Madrone area of that in the North Complex Fire, very, very, very impacted, including their water delivery system for the community, and they have nothing there. So the water system was wiped out. So the district there, their water district, submitted several public assistance claims, but it took years for the submission, then a denial, then an appeal, a denial again to take place for that assistance. And during that time, what was there of the water district, what the infrastructure was allowed to deteriorate even more. Part of it may well have been salvageable, but we couldn't get the teams out there, we couldn't get the coordination amongst everybody to look at the district and see what it really was going to be and what level. So FEMA didn't meet their required deadlines to respond on that. So a lot of time and effort and maybe even valuable infrastructure was lost. So especially a really small town like that, kind of like Mr. Huffman was talking about, are extremely impacted because they have limited staff, a limited ability to apply for this or ask for grants and things like that. So what I'd ask you is that if you could take, at your level, another look at Lake Madrone, the North Complex Fire in Northern California, and see if you really believe they got a fair shake on that, because they absolutely need the assistance, and so much time went by before that they're just on the short end of it now. So, and then overall, I'd like to see if we could commit the coordination with the state folks more so, like Cal OES in our case, so our applicants can know what the resources can be more quickly and respond to that, so there's less local suffering, basically. So would your office be able to work with mine and with HUD, and as well as California's entities, to find a way to compact these timelines and not have these unnecessary delays?
Absolutely. On the first point, we will certainly take a look at the case that you mentioned. I obviously don't have the specifics on that here, but happy to take a look at that. And we have worked over the last 2 years to really figure out ways that we can be better engaged with our customers and have more, again, of a people-first approach, customer-centric approach to the way that we're delivering our programs. And sometimes it just takes that one-on-one communication. And so you do have my commitment to make sure that we're doing everything we can to work with the communities within your district, but across California and the rest of the country
Okay, I
to
appreciate
better
it.
understand that.
On the Madrone one, it took a strong effort by my staff to finally say, everybody come to one meeting and meet on this. And that did happen, but it was quite a long time after the fire and the deterioration. One last one is that we need to look at things that happen post-wildfire that aren't necessarily the fire directly, but have a direct, the mudslides, let me talk about that, okay? Mudslide issues, or you can tie directly back to the cause being the wildfire, so we need to have after effects taken into account too. So do you think we can look at that process so that mudslides directly related to a fire could be part of that conversation?
It's definitely one of the concerns that we always have after a wildfire, and we do have post-wildfire hazard mitigation assessment teams that will go into communities and better understand what the cascading impacts might be and what types of mitigation projects we need to put in place now to help protect those communities. And so you have my commitment to continue working on that, and we're happy to provide your staff a briefing on what that work does.
Thanks very much. And then I'll just mention in 5 seconds, pre-positioning resources for wildfires would be a key component as well going forward. So, Madam Chairman, thank you for the time. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. LaMalfa. The chair will recognize Mr. Carter from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Administrator Griswold, for being here with us today. There are at least 5 major Army Corps of Engineer projects that are being held up in my district currently due to funding gap. With INF having been implemented and the DRF, Disaster Recovery Fund, running low, what happens if this fund is not replenished by Congress?
Congressman, the projects that you currently mentioned, the obligations are on hold because they're not life-saving, life-sustaining projects, and we want to continue to reserve what's left of the DRF to support those efforts for things like we saw in Hurricane Idalia or in the Maui wildfires. As soon as the DRF is replenished, you have my commitment to begin reimbursing these projects on a first-in, first-out basis. And we will work around the clock 7 days a week to expedite those payments, but we cannot do so until the DRF is replenished.
We know that the time frame that we previously have known as hurricane season is dramatically extending year over year. If the $2.4 billion storm were to hit right now and empty the DRF, what would happen if a subsequent disaster struck with the Disaster Recovery Fund sitting on zero?
We are monitoring our disaster relief fund very closely, which is why that we implemented the immediate needs funding. If we have another catastrophic event that happens at the same time, we will continue to prioritize those most critical life-saving activities to ensure that we have the resources that can go into communities and save lives. Continue to delay the obligations for the recovery projects, and then perhaps, if needed, for some of those life-sustaining projects that are happening so we can focus our efforts on life safety.
We know that these storms come harder, come faster, stay longer, leave more devastation in their path. We also know that there is a looming chance that the government can shut down or even have a continuing resolution. In the case of such a drastic act of shutting down the government or having a continuing resolution that freezes funding, what does that do to your agency and all of the ongoing natural disasters that you're currently facing?
Should a lapse in appropriations occur, then anything that would remain in our disaster relief fund carryover balance would be moved forward, but given our current state, it would be insufficient to cover all of our ongoing life-saving operations. And we would, again, have to continue to reduce the scope of what it is that we are supporting in our operations. We would be legally able to incur obligations for activities necessary for life-saving and protection of human life, but again, we would have to further reduce those types of life-saving operations that we are working on based on the amount of funding that we have available.
Isn't it true that if such an action of shutting down the government or having a continuing resolution that drastically impedes your ability to provide resources impacts Democrats, Republicans, independents, and the like throughout our country?
A lapse in appropriation for FEMA's Disaster Relief Fund has an impact on everybody across this nation from, again, our ability to do life-saving actions in a number of places, as well as ongoing recovery projects, regardless of where they're at.
As a result of climate change, deadly heat waves have gripped our nation from coast to coast. What step is the agency taking to mitigate heat hazards in our community? In my state alone, wildfires that we have been unprecedented in Louisiana, Bayou Sauvage burning out of control. Share with us what measures you're taking. We see this happening more and more in places it's never happened before. People that have never suffered these calamities are now dealing with them. Share with us what actions your agency is taking to address them.
Yeah, I think, Representative Carter, what you have described is this convergence of multiple climate-related hazards that are coming together on communities in ways that we haven't seen before, where, decades of drought combined with extreme heat creating unprecedented wildfires in areas or heat domes in areas that are lasting longer than they ever have. Our mitigation programs definitely can help support communities to better understand the types of threats and risks that they not just face today, but the risks that they're going to face in the future, and how we can use our mitigation funds to help mitigate and reduce the impact of these risks, whether it's creating green space and white roofs to reduce the impact of heat, or hazard mitigation to help reduce the spread of wildfires in communities that have that type of threat. Our mitigation programs are so critical to helping communities across this country better understand what their risk is and how we can help reduce the impact so they don't have these long, complex recoveries, but most of all, that we can save lives.
Thank you very much. My time is up. And Madam Chair, I'm just going to end with this statement, because I will never pass up an opportunity when in your presence to talk about Risk Rating 2.0 and the devastation that it has, particularly on Louisiana, but in multiple other states. And I will continue to encourage that we put our heads together. Thank you for the time that you've spent in discussing back and forth this issue that is far yet resolved. But I thank you for the efforts, and I implore you to continue working with us in a bipartisan way to address the issue of Risk Rating 2.0 that is devastating, particularly for Louisiana. Thank you, ma'am. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Carter. The chair looks forward to yielding to Mr. Graves from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
Thank you, thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to thank my friend from Louisiana for bringing up some local issues, and I want to pick up where he left off. Administrator, we had a chance to cover some ground in Louisiana in the past and talk through a number of issues, and in this case, I want to talk about where Mr. Carter left off, and that's Risk Rating 2.0. You're part of the federal government that is comprised of our hundreds of millions of citizens. We, I think, thrive on transparency and accountability. The fact that FEMA has continued to hide behind this proprietary model on the methodology for determining rates for Risk Rating 2.0, and Mr. Carter and I are incapable of explaining to the people that we represent why their rates have gone from $560 a year under preferred risk to $8,000 or $9,000 a year. It's not okay that we can't explain it. It's not okay that FEMA tries to hide behind this proprietary model. And I just want to ask you, would you make transparent the methodology and allow us to explain to our constituents why their rates are skyrocketing, explain to our constituents how levy protection and other features are actually benefiting them, that in many cases, property taxes, sales taxes, and appropriations, Congressman Carter and I and others have been able to secure, are actually making them safer.
Congressman, Risk Rating 2.0, I believe one of the most important factors about Risk Rating 2.0 is that it bases our flood insurance rates on a home's unique risk. And while we have seen a significant amount of policies across the nation that have had decreases, we also know that now that we understand a home's unique risk, many of the policies, many of which are in Louisiana, their rates have gone up. We have provided several
That's not
briefings,
answering
and
the
we
question
have-
on transparency. The question is transparency. I can't explain to a constituent why their rates have doubled, tripled, quadrupled, or what have you. I can't explain to a constituent how the levee that is right behind their house actually provides them a level of protection if FEMA's refusing to be transparent. You're part of the federal government. This lack of transparency, it's not okay. And the fact that you have some places where rates are skyrocketing when these people are, according to your maps, outside the flood zone. Like it doesn't make sense. And something, if we're just going to talk common sense for just a minute, homes are static structures in many cases. Concrete slab at grade, I understand we've come in and elevated them under ICC and other programs, but in reality, if people complied with the rules at the time they built their home, in some cases these homes have been here for hundreds of years, and all of a sudden we're going to come in and change conditions on them, and we're going to refuse to provide any degree of transparency, I'd like a commitment from you that you're going to be transparent and provide the methodology to the American public, let people look at it, understand it, and perhaps perfect it.
Congressman Graves, we continue to provide briefings to your staff and others on how we have
I'll
developed
take
this
that as a no.
program,
And as
but
we're
I will
talking about
continue
lack
to
of
work with your
transparency,
team
I want to talk about something else. There was a meeting that was held at the White House on May 11th of this year with the National Security Council, FEMA, and others talking about NSC stepping in and taking over effectively coordination of disasters or emergencies. That's what Congress charged you to do. Can you shed any light on what this is that the White House is coming in and taking this over? Can you share documents with the committee and help us understand this better, since we're the ones who actually write the laws?
Thank you for that question. Recovery is and will remain one of the core functions that FEMA does, and we are always looking for ways that we can improve on how we deliver not just our programs, but help coordinate the federal family for long-term recovery. Maui is a great example of how we have set up a long-term recovery operation in the county with the state, using the leadership of our state and local leadership to help drive the requirements. There's always room to improve, and one of the things that we are working as a result of Hawaii with the NSC on is bringing together our cabinet secretaries to help ensure that they have visibility of all of the things that their programs and their agencies are doing on the ground. That is the commitment that I have to continue to support communities like Maui with these long-term recovery operations, making sure that FEMA sustains their role of being that agency that has the ability to coordinate across all federal agencies.
So Administrator, look, you got a tough job. You do, and I appreciate your willingness to do it. Every time you step in, it's because there's a disaster. That's not an enviable position. But I want to be clear that the Congress has charged you with that responsibility. And if there is some proposed change there, this committee deserves transparency to make sure that we believe it's consistent with the law and congressional intent. And I just want to ask your commitment to provide us transparency on this as well. Is that a commitment that you're willing to provide?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Last thing, and I know I'll be quick here. Duplication of benefits drives me crazy because I watch our federal government be incredibly inefficient. We have resiliency programs or mitigation programs in FEMA and Corps of Engineers and HUD, in Interior, at Department of Agriculture, in NOAA, and many, many others. We explicitly wrote a change in the law in DARA in 18 that said that duplication of benefits with Corps of Engineer programs and HMGP does not exist, meaning you can pay for it through HMGP. Yet I have watched where FEMA has refused and said that you could not provide HMGP funds to a Corps project that was in the 7001 report, that I'll make note does not mean it's funded. Yet you've had the situations where Washington, D.C. has gotten funds for, quote, tree equity. I don't know what the hell that is. Gotten money for tree equity. Meanwhile, Portland has gotten funds through similar programs. So why is it that if Forest Service is going to fund urban tree planting, how come FEMA will fund it as well through BRIC? Why isn't that a duplication of benefits?
I don't have the specifics of
Could you
why we
please
did or not,
give
but
us an
be
answer
happy
on
to
that?
follow up with your
Thank you.
staff
I
on
appreciate it.
that.
I'm sorry for going over. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Graves. The chair will recognize Mr. Stanton from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for allowing me to participate in the subcommittee to discuss an issue of great importance and urgency to my home state in Arizona. Administrator Criswell, communities along the southern border are on the front lines of an ongoing humanitarian crisis. Right now, federal migrant holding facilities are well over capacity. Last week, DHS began unnoticed release of migrants on the streets of small, rural Arizona communities like Bisbee, Nogales, and Douglas, Arizona. And instead of providing the necessary resources to support these border communities in housing, feeding, transporting vulnerable migrants, the federal government has shifted federal assistance away from Arizona to other states and made it much harder for local governments to get reimbursed for costs incurred. Now, I'm a former mayor, and I know how tight municipal budgets are, but frankly, it is insulting that the federal government is forcing them in to such a precarious financial position. Administrator, I'm particularly concerned about FEMA's complete lack of transparency in how the Shelter and Services Program funds are allocated, and why such a disproportionately small amount of the overall funding has come to Arizona's overwhelmed border communities. In its June guidance, FEMA stated simply that eligible applicant allocations were, quote, based on release and destination data received from CBP and Emergency Food and Shelter Program humanitarian requests made in fiscal year 2023, unquote. No other information was provided for how these funds would be allocated. The Southern Arizona Coalition, which includes Pima and Santa Cruz counties, the city of Tucson, and Catholic Community Services, has a combined monthly costs that have averaged more than $2 million a month this summer, and their costs are steadily rising as DHS releases more than 1,000 migrants on average every day. But they were eligible to apply for just $10.9 million in assistance through the Shelter and Services Program, while New York, 2,000 miles away, received 10 times that. I've been told the funds Southern Arizona has received will only last about 5 months. That's due in part to deep cuts these local governments and nonprofits that were forced to make in other areas. It is simply not right. Administrator Criswell, why is there such an enormous disparity between the resources allocated to border communities compared to interior communities under this program? Shouldn't the needs of Arizona's border communities and those in other border states be weighed more heavily when allocating these critical funds?
Representative Stanton, we know that there is great need out there for these funds, and through our legacy program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program, humanitarian, with the direction of Congress to establish our new Shelter and Services Program, we used our legacy program to administer the first portion of that funding, which highly favored our border cities. As we implemented the Shelter and Services Program, we did begin to take into greater account release data, but also destination data, as we understand that communities across the country are incurring costs as they're providing shelter and services for the migrants. As we move into the next fiscal year, and if the program continues to be funded, we will be basing this more on a competitive program to take into account the existing data and impacts that communities are experiencing as we make decisions for future funding allocations.
So are you committing today that FEMA will make this moving forward a competitive grant program like the Emergency Food and Shelter Program to disperse funds?
The Emergency Food and Shelter Program was not a competitive grant program as compared to our traditional grant programs. The Shelter and Services Program will be more of a competitive program similar to our other grant programs.
I'm happy to hear that there'll be additional rounds of funding. When that funding occurs, how will you address the significant shortfall by Arizona's border communities in responding to the increased number of asylum seekers being released by DHS?
This program, even through our legacy program, but as well as the Shelter and Service Program, continues to be oversubscribed, and I anticipate it will continue to be oversubscribed. We will use data collected from CBP to help make those decisions, but again, we know that many communities will not get enough funding for the costs that they are incurring.
SSP funding is far more restrictive in covering costs incurred by local governments and NGOs. Why are SSP funds so much more restrictive than the funding received previously under the Emergency Food and Shelter Service Program? What was the rationale for capping hotel costs now when it previously wasn't capped?
I would have to go back with my team on some of the specifics on how we made those decisions and those requirements within our program. But again, this program is a new program for FEMA. This was the first iteration of the Shelter and Service Program. We always continue to improve based on the lessons learned on the initial allocation of those funds. Happy to continue to work with you and your staff on ways we can continue to improve.
Madam
this.
Chair, I have one final quick question, if I might, dealing with extreme heat, another important issue to Arizona. Are extreme heat declarations eligible for a Stafford Act disaster declaration, or does the Stafford Act need to be amended to include extreme heat conditions?
The Stafford Act does not need to be amended to include extreme heat. We base our decisions on a number of factors, mostly on what does it exceed the capacity of the state and local jurisdictions. If the response to an extreme heat incident exceeds the capacity of a state and local jurisdiction, they are very open to submit a disaster declaration request, and we will consider that based on whether or not it exceeds their capacity.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. The chair will recognize Mr. Rouser from North Carolina for 5 minutes.
Thank the Madam Chair and Madam Administrator. Thank you so much for being here. As my friend and colleague Garrett Graves, pardon me. I know Grigsby somewhere else. As my colleague Mr. Graves mentioned, there's no question you have a tough job. I will reiterate what he underscored, and that the duplication of benefits really is a big issue for a lot of us. And we would love to see the administration stick with the intent of Congress, on that, because that certainly is a big issue for many of our disaster survivors. Speaking of disasters, we have a lot of hurricanes come through. Obviously, my district is southeastern North Carolina. In 2016, we had Hurricane Matthew, had a lot of flooding with that. In 2018, we had Hurricane Florence, a tremendous amount of flooding with that. And, it's quite common for residents who live in condominiums, homeowners associations, housing cooperatives, that when those natural disasters hit, they can get no assistance from FEMA. And just curious if you foresee that will continue to be the case, or if there's been any internal discussion about modifying the rules and regulations to where they would be eligible moving forward.
So, Congressman, people who own their homes, whether that be a individual home, whether that be a condo, whether they're a renter in one of those homes, they're all eligible for our programs. Our decisions are based on a number of factors. One is most certainly the amount of insurance they have and what insurance covers, and then whether they have actual damages to their homes and what we can repair for those homes. But we also provide things like rental assistance, which people are eligible for regardless of whether they're a homeowner or a renter. If there's something specific that you have an example of, I'd be happy to work with your staff to look at it and better understand what that circumstance was. But there's no factor that does not allow somebody who owns a condo to be eligible for our programs.
Well, historically, FEMA has been very resistant to helping those that are technically classified as a homeowners association, and many people live in, neighborhoods, big and small, that have a homeowners association, and therefore they can't get debris picked up. There's always, municipalities get reimbursed through public assistance for picking up debris, et cetera. Well, they won't pick up debris in a homeowners association, for that reason. I have some legislation that will help clarify this and, make everybody's life a little easier. It is H.R. 3777, the Disaster Assistance Fairness Act. But I'm not so sure that what's included in the legislation couldn't be addressed with a simple rulemaking because it very much fits within the intent and scope of FEMA's work during disaster recovery. And so I'd love to visit with you more about that and offline, and appreciate your attention to it.
Yeah, thank you for that further explanation, and we'd be happy to provide direct technical assistance, drafting technical assistance on what you're working on.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Rouser. With that, the chair recognizes Mr. Ryan from New York for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for allowing me to join. Thank you, Administrator, not only for your service to our nation now, but also for your service to New York in your previous roles. As I believe you're aware, and certainly your team is aware, several communities in my district in the Hudson Valley of New York, Cornwall, Highland Falls, Fort Montgomery, and West Point were absolutely devastated in early July with unprecedented over 8 inches of rain in just a few hours, absolutely overwhelming all of the systems, processes, resources that the community had ever had to deal with or prepare for. Tragically, we did lose one young woman to that flood. We've had hundreds displaced. Since the flood, my team and I have personally spoken with hundreds of affected residents. As is always the case, and you know this well, each of their stories is just heartbreaking. One that I cannot stop thinking about, a veteran in my community, 100% disability rating from the VA who suffered TBI and other serious injuries, still fighting and struggling to get any help to rebuild his home that was completely condemned. And despite all the work by you and your team, despite the declaration of a federal disaster and some of the public assistance, folks like him and hundreds of others are still without any help and any relief. Almost none of them had flood insurance because of the topography of where they live. It was absolutely almost impossible that they could have experienced something like this, but tragically they did. So I want to commend you and thank the President and the administration for pushing to declare the disaster declaration, for working with a good team on the ground to start to get the public assistance flowing. But the number one question that I hear still in our office is, why have we not received an individual assistance declaration? Both the breadth, but really the depth of the damage for several hundred families is just devastating. And the gentleman's story that I shared is just one. We've got kids living in condemned homes because they just have no other options, seniors without homes. So I've invited you to come. I know you're very busy, but I would ask you or one of your senior leaders to commit to come and look those folks in the eye with me, help explain what's going on, and brainstorm what we can do to help them. Can we count on you to do that, Administrator?
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously don't have the specifics on why we haven't yet. Happy to look into that personally, but you have my commitment. If I can't make it, one of my senior leaders can join you to better understand the impacts to this community.
I appreciate it. And building on questions from several of my colleagues, specifically Mr. Huffman, can you explain why in the midst of a disaster like this, it is so darn hard and complicated and opaque, which seems to be a theme that we've heard throughout the questioning, that we can't just answer residents who are devastated why they're not getting individual assistance, and what we can do to change that, what my team and I, what all the local officials and our governor and our county leadership and local leadership who've all been working as a team. Can you help explain that?
Yeah, there are a number of factors that we look at when we are making a determination on whether to recommend a declaration for both public assistance and individual assistance. And again, a good portion of that falls on what the capacity of not just the local jurisdiction is, but what the state should be able to do to also support. And we understand when there's communities, small rural communities in states like New York that have large urban centers, that it creates a greater capacity that the state should be able to come in and also provide a level of assistance. And so all of those are factors that are taken into consideration, not just the impact to the one community, but how much the state should also be able to support.
And I appreciate your commitment to personally look into this. I can tell you on the ground, while the state has contributed significantly, it is nowhere near meeting the need, specifically for folks, frankly, that don't qualify for some of the income thresholds, but had no flood insurance and are far beyond their means to repair devastating damage. So we have to, as Americans, be able to figure out how to navigate this. And myself and my team will be available anytime, anywhere to you and your team. So thank you to your folks that have been on the ground and helping. And we'll certainly be persistent in following up with you on your kind commitment today. So thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair, or Mr. Chair, I apologize.
The chair thanks the gentleman. The chair is now in agreement with the ranking member that we're going to go for a second round. And so the chair will recognize himself for the beginning of that second round of questions. Administrator Criswell, I think you highlighted the CREW Act in your testimony now and verbally numerous times regarding how it helped in staffing shortages. Yet in your letter and your responses to letters from Chairman Graves, FEMA resources and personnel have been diverted to help deal with the border crisis. And I'd ask the unanimous consent to have these emails admitted to the record and without objection so ordered. On March 17th, an email of yours provided to the committee in response to these oversight letters shows that you emailed Secretary Mayorkas that both you and FEMA's Region 3 administrator had discussed the current state of coordination based on her observations. Everything you said is kind of unclear because it's heavily redacted, as you can see here, but what I can see is that you expressed concerns committing her to no longer than 30 days, and then on the following day, on March 18th, you received an email from the Secretary thanking you for supporting FEMA Region 3 administrators' dedication to the border coordination with IMAT support for a 30-day period. Now, the IMAT teams are specialties, as I understand it, that deal with disasters. Does that mean you and the Secretary agree there's a disaster on the border? I mean, you sent one of these. Go ahead, ma'am.
Our incident management assistance teams are unique teams that are trained to deal with complex problems. And the skill set that they bring, specifically the team that our Region 3 administrator leads, is a team made up of collateral leaders across our agency designed to support a variety of different incidents to help bring that level of collaboration, coordination, and communication, the skill set that our emergency managers bring to all of the problems that we solve.
Okay, so it's not about disasters.
So this was specifically about creating an organizational structure to help support our partners across the department, establish a sound, unified coordination.
So I guess by transposition, then, if it's not a disaster and it's to create this team, then we're saying that apparently Secretary Mayorkas and Department of Homeland Security doesn't have what it needs, is not equipped to handle what's happening on the southern border because they're calling on you. You're resource challenged by your admission. You even were concerned per your email. Then in November, you emailed the Secretary, indicated that he had requested support again from your Region 3 administrator on the border. And I would remind you that Region 3 covers Pennsylvania and the district I am proud to represent. And I'm concerned about those folks in the district that are paying the taxes for FEMA to support them, and to remind everybody that Region 3, the district we're talking about, or the region we're talking about, had 11 major disaster declarations, not including COVID, during that period. I'm concerned, as you are, how many personnel, how many people did FEMA send to the border, and what was the duration, since I can't find out from these emails?
The specific instance that you are talking about with our Region 3 regional administrator, again, is part of an IMAT team that's made up of collateral personnel from across our agency, many from headquarters. Our Region 3.
Okay, that's great. How many for how long?
They have a handful of people. I don't know exactly how many from that team, but that team is only 12 people, and they
So
went
it wouldn't
in,
be more than 12?
It would not be more than 12.
Okay, and you don't know how long or how many instances at this point?
That team was sent to here in DC to work with our partners across the department to help them establish what is now the Southwest Border Coordination Center, and they helped them.
Okay, but while they were here in DC or out the Southwest border, they weren't focused on Region 3, which is Pennsylvania, which is what they were hired to do. It's what they're supposed, that's their daily responsibility, right? And while we're having disasters in that region, they're focused on Washington, DC, and the border particularly. I mean, that's what I see here. I mean,
Again, the only person on that team from Region 3 is the one person who is the lead. This is a team that's
But that's
made
also
up,
the person in Region 3 that's the lead for Region 3.
But this team is made up of collateral personnel to come help support a variety of incidents.
I get it,
We
but
happen
my
to
point
activate
is
them for
that
one.
this person is not focused on the regions that's having disasters because they're focused on the border. And while we might disagree or agree why the border disaster is happening, I would contend that it's happening because of the policies of this administration. So the people in Pennsylvania that are paying for their region administrator don't get their region administrator because the administration determines that that person is going to be on the southwest border or in Washington, D.C., dealing with a southwest border problem caused by this administration. Let me ask you this final question. Who's paying for that? Who's paying for that?
For the Region 3.
For the IMAT team, for the Region 3 coordinator, for the person that's supposed to be in Pennsylvania, that's in Washington, D.C., dealing with the southwest border, who's paying for that?
These are part of our appropriated funds.
FEMA is paying for that. So FEMA's paying for the border, right? So when you pay your taxes and we say, oh, well, that's all going to the Department of Homeland Security, this portion to secure the border, that's not true. Department of Homeland Security is now requiring FEMA to take some of their disaster relief people and send them somewhere to deal with the border. That's how we're also dealing with it. So it's costing doubly. Not only is Homeland Security, and by the way, I don't know if people realize this, but you're not supposed to be duplicating services that are provided by another agency, whether it's Interior, whether it's Forestry. You're doing that with planting trees as well, by the way. That's another story. But on this occasion, you are duplicating services that are supposed to be handled by the Department of Homeland Security with FEMA dollars, and yet FEMA is demanding and asking, and maybe rightly so in many cases, for a supplement for disaster assistance funding. At the same time, they're spending America's tax-paying dollars that are supposed to go to disaster relief on the southwest border in a disaster created by policy by this administration. With that, I yield, and I recognize the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Thank you. Let's go back and talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. It's been called the greatest investment in environmental policy in a lifetime. One of the things that it did was authorize FEMA's public assistance and hazard mitigation programs to provide reimbursement for the use of low-carbon materials and incorporate future climate projections into their emergency management plans. Use net zero energy as well. Would you talk about how that has been helpful, how you're leveraging that, how it fits into your overall recovery and replacement or rebuilding schemes?
We're grateful for that added ability to reimburse jurisdictions that use this type of construction methodology to, one, increase their resilience as we're rebuilding, but also reduce the impact on our environment. And so this is a new program. These are the types of projects that take years to build. I'm very excited to see how our jurisdictions across the country are now going to be able to build back in a way that not only makes them more resilient, but makes them better for the environment as we go forward.
Wouldn't this kind of epitomize build back better, so we don't build back just the way it was before the disaster, so that if that incident occurs again, we are faced with the whole same problem one more time?
Absolutely. Our goal is to build back better so communities do not have to repeat the complex recoveries that they're facing today.
So in the long run, this would be a more efficient use of taxpayer dollars, and it'd probably be cheaper as you amortize it out over future disasters.
Every dollar that we invest in mitigation saves $6 in recovery.
Okay. And is that across all kinds of disasters, whether it's fire or hurricane or whatever? It's just a general?
That's the current studies show that a dollar invested in mitigation saves $6 in recovery. I'm sure it varies slightly from type of event to type of event, but that is the recent study that came out shows how much mitigation does save our taxpayers in the end from recovery.
So this would be a good thing to save taxpayer dollars while also trying to save the planet.
Absolutely.
Thank you. I yield back.
Chair, thanks the gentlelady. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Lamov.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks for allowing me to sit in here and for a second round of questions today. Appreciate it. So, Ms. Criswell, again, thank you for your appearance and for the coordination we've been able to have with FEMA in Northern California after the many disasters. So, in recovery from wildfires in my own district, we've had a lot of great strides, but some bureaucratic challenges, not necessarily in your department, have delayed progress and really true recovery so that victims can get back to normal. So just removing hazardous trees or to build housing, fix a road, the local jurisdiction must do a NEPA, every project within the recovery process has a separate NEPA requirement, which can take a year to produce, and oftentimes for things that are very basic. You wouldn't need a full-blown NEPA for changing a culvert or repairing, especially already existing infrastructure. So not much has changed on the process of how NEPAs are done, so my constituents continue to say, hey, this is such a pain for them. It really does take more time, and sometimes opportunities as grant dollars run out and permits, other types of permits may expire. So, or more conditions keep getting added on. So it would be, I believe, and many folks have weighed in with me, that couldn't we have one big regional NEPA after, in this case, a wildfire, for the whole burn scar, and have that applicable for all recovery and mitigation projects tied to a disaster that was declared by the president? Wouldn't that seem like a common sense way of doing it? Just having an area-wide, in this case, burn scar-wide NEPA, and do it as a catch-all instead of so much duplication like this zone, this project. Is that something we could strive for, do you believe?
There are a number of policies out there when we're doing our environmental and historic reviews, and NEPA is certainly one of those that are out there. There are tools in our toolbox that can do programmatic reviews, but again, each instance is very different. We would have to work with each jurisdiction to better understand how we can apply broader application of our tools, which we have done in some areas, but we can't do it in every area because they're all so specific. And so I can't give you a general answer, but happy to continue to work with you on ways that we can streamline this process, because we also recognize it's one of those pieces of this recovery and rebuilding effort that has some of the longer timelines associated with it.
Well, thank you. Indeed, in the Paradise area, the Camp Fire, we're going to be 5 years in November, and we're still chasing permits to remove hazardous trees. These are dead trees that are, not going to be part of the landscape or a positive part, maybe a handful for woodpeckers, but not to the extent there's acres and acres. And this is still keeps just a dark cloud over recovery, over building, and indeed getting insurance again for the area. The insurance companies are pulling out of California and pulling out of areas like this, even though what you would really look at, the risk has changed completely after that, such a devastating fire, such a complete fire. Once these trees are removed, it'll be a much more insurable area for folks. And you have folks, one lady, one anecdote, and I'll stop. A lady and her, I think, 2 kids were when they're in their home, and during a wind event, trees were falling over, dead trees, and you could hear them cracking that haven't fallen yet. She finally decided she was gonna have to get her family out of her home because she was within reach of some of the trees, and go take a hotel down the hill in the town of Chico rather than stay in her home, because we keep hanging on with an inability to quickly and efficiently remove the hazardous trees that still exist there. So we don't need to NEPA to death every little project, indeed a coordination of projects into one. The darn NEPA doesn't teach you that much anyway. I don't know if they even read the thing, at the end of the day. Is it gonna affect a yellow-toed salamander or what have you? The work is gonna get done. It needs to get done. It's just a lot more pain. So if you could, we need help on that Lake Madrone thing, as we mentioned a while ago. And if in your conversations with the regulators on this, please emphasize that a broader approach, a burn scar approach, would be very helpful for everybody, I'm sure for your department and for the people that are actually victims. So thank you for that, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Are there any further questions from any members of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I would like to thank each of the witness for her testimony and for being here today. It's tough questions, tough job. We appreciate you. And we thank you for coming and taking the heat. This hearing is adjourned.